Nesta noite de abertura do 4º Encontro Paranaense de Bibliotecários, temos a honra de contar com a presença do professor Peter Burke, que irá proferir a palestra com o tema The Last 500 Years. E solicitamos que as perguntas sejam encaminhadas após a finalização da palestra. Peter Burke é doutor em História pela University of Oxford, Inglaterra. Foi professor da Princeton University, Estados Unidos da América, e atualmente é professor emérito da University of Cambridge, Inglaterra. Especialista em teoria da história e do conhecimento, Burke tem mais de 30 obras publicadas. Possui doutorado na Universidade de Oxford, foi professor de História das Ideias na School of European Studies da University de Essex, professor na Universidade de Sussex e professor da Universidade de Princeton. Senhoras e senhores, com a palavra o professor Peter Burke.
So, good evening, everybody, and thank you for the generous introduction. It's an honor to open this conference. It's a pleasure to be here in Ponta Grossa, and it's a privilege to be allowed to speak my native language. Could I have the first image, please, number 0? Okay. In the last few years, there has been a boom in the history of libraries, just as there has been a boom in the history of the book. This expansion is particularly noticeable in my part of the world, since in the year 2006 there were published 3 large volumes about the history of libraries in Britain. But there are similar publications in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the United States, and perhaps more countries where I don't follow the publications so closely. However, the rise of these studies might have a dark side. Remember Hegel's owl. That is, Hegel's famous remark, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. In other words, when scholars begin to study a subject and publish books about it, it is likely that that thing, institution, whatever, is already in decline, like the Roman Empire. So, at all events, the history of libraries has attracted increasing interest at exactly the same time that many actual libraries are closing. In Britain, for example, there has been recent severe cuts in funding for public. In the years more than it is to keep only one copy of a given book in a city such as Amsterdam, on the grounds that if people want, they can consult that book online. That's the reason for the image up there. It's a monument, and it's, I can't say erected, but it can be seen on the Babelsplatz in Berlin. But the eloquent and there is one missing in the square. It's replaced by glass. You look down and you see nothing but empty shelves. And I feel that makes an appropriate symbol of the threat to the physical book today. the beginning of the possible obsolescence of paper books, not to mention journals and newspapers, where we see the trend rather more quickly. So it seems to be a moment to reflect on the idea of the library. Studies of this idea are actually not new. The first example known to me is about 400 years old. It was a book published in Latin, Idea Bibliotecários Universais. But recent contributions include an article on the idea of the library in the ancient world, another article on the idea of the library in the 21st century, an article published actually in 1995. My only problem with this phrase, the idea of the library, is the singular. I think I'm trying to think in the plural about different ideas about library. Ideas that compete, contradict, or sometimes complement one another, as well as succeeding one another in approximately chronological order. And for this reason, the first part of this lecture will discuss 6 types of the library in order, distinguishing them by their function. I begin then with the library as a storehouse, then as a library as a place for research, then the lending library, then the national library, then the multimedia library, and finally the virtual library. 6 different ideas then of what a library is or should be. And then in the second part of the lecture, rather shorter, I'm going to be concerned with the materialization of different ideas. I'm afraid all my examples will be Western. I know there is a lot to say about libraries outside the West, from Beijing to Timbuktu, but one can't know everything. I'm simply not the person to be talking on this subject. And the title of this lecture was The Last 600 Years. In fact, I really need to be more ambitious. I should have said perhaps the last 1200 years, because beginning with the monastic library in the West means going back to the early Middle Ages. Could I have the next image, please? In the early Middle Ages, as you know, books were expensive. Not only were they written by hand, they were written on an expensive material. In the year 600 AD or and monasteries were the places with the largest libraries. A large monastic library would include as many as 200 librarians, was to keep the books safe. A common name for librarian in the early Middle Ages was the librorum, so the keeper of the books, keeping the books safe in cupboards or chests. And as you see, the cupboards need to be very large. Later, as books multiplied and displayed shelves, can I have the next one, please? They were chained to those shelves to prevent theft. There are many examples of in Britain. This one comes from a cathedral library in Hereford on the Welsh border. And in many places, the chains still survive. in the Middle Ages, the library was essentially a page. But I have to make one point about lending books. To be fair, intermonastic loan system where manuscripts were taken from one monastery to another. And one should also remember a medieval proverb. A monastery without a library is like a castle without an armory. Now I move to the second type of library, which I call, maybe too grandly, the research library, at least the library as a place of study. As in the case of libraries of universities and colleges, but also the royal libraries in Paris and London, the Imperial Library in Vienna, and so on. So now we've reached 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Facilities for study included a reading room, often a grand one. Next, please. That's the one in Oxford. It's called Duke Humphrey's Library because a 15th century Duke Humphrey, paid for it to be constructed. Or, the next, please, is in the Vatican, rather magnificently painted. Or again, and the next, please, one in Vienna, where this magnificent room is still known as a saal, which means the hall of display, displaying the books, but not only displaying the books, also displaying the wealth and learning of the patron to any visitor that entered. It has to be admitted that grand reading rooms of this kind did not impress everybody equally favourably. British Protestant clergyman who was touring Italy in the 17th century, when he was in Milan, of course, he visited the Ambrosiana Library, one of the great libraries of Europe at that time. He complained in the travels there are like scandalous things. The room is often fine and richly adorned, but the books are few, ill bound, and worse chosen. Of course, if a library is a place for study, the key point is access. And I have to say that in the 16th, 17th centuries, even in universities, the access to books was often extremely limited. Foreign scholars who, visiting Oxford or visiting Venice, they complained of the difficulties they encountered, one in the Marciana, the other in the Bodleian, because the librarians were like dragons. They were guarding their treasures. They were still in the age of the Custos Librorum, where the important thing was preserving the books, even at the price of not letting anybody turn the pages. Again, the next one, please. The University of Leiden in the Netherlands. It's a nice picture because it shows people taking their ease and consulting the books. But one has to say that that library in Leiden, in the Dutch Republic, it was only open in those days for 2 hours in the afternoon on 2 days of the week, Wednesdays and Saturdays. The professors had the keys so that they could go in at any time. But everybody else, the whole of the student population, they only had those 4 hours a week to look at the books. Of course, access to the books has become much easier. The next one, please. This is one of the most spectacular examples, because if you want to read in the British Library, you have to fill in forms and people have to write references for you and so on. But the New York Public Library, which you see there, almost anybody can come off the street, they're American citizens at least, and they have the right to that library. So I move now to the third type of library. Of course, the alternative to building a grand room for people to study in was to allow people to take the books away. The practice has quite a long history in the case of a small number of libraries, among them, interestingly, the Vatican in Rome. From the 15th century, there is a register of borrowers preserved. It's fascinating to see which individuals borrowed which books at that time. But it was only from the 18th century onwards that the lending library became a common institution, at the same time in Europe and in parts of the New World. The first form that they took, at least in the Anglophone world, I mean both Britain and the British colony in America, was the book club. Members of these clubs, the upper-class males, paid a subscription which entitled them not only to borrow books, but also to attend banquets and balls. Today's librarians might like to think about reviving the tradition of banquets and balls as a way of attracting more readers to the library. And then in the second phase, the late 18th, early 19th centuries now, lending libraries, down in English as circulating libraries, became more of a commercial enterprise. Lower subscriptions allowed many more people to join. Women for the first time, because they didn't join the original book clubs, the middle class and not just the nobility. So here, next one please. That's the first page of the catalogue of an North American circulating library of the early 19th century. Again, it's interesting to know what kinds of books they would have on their shelves. And then in the third phase, you have the free lending library, founded in many cities in a number of countries. I think the most famous examples are North American, thanks to the millionaire philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. He funded many municipal libraries in the United States. In Britain, there was a parliamentary initiative, the Libraries Act of 1850. Once again, public funds at a municipal level were directed to the establishment of libraries in every city and small town. In major cities such as Birmingham, the next one please, you can see a quite magnificent reading room, like an imposing town hall, and there were imposing town halls erected in British cities at this time. An elegant library building was a matter of civic pride. Of course, it was a way of competing with other cities. If Birmingham had one like that, Manchester would be sure to follow, and Leeds, and so on. Nearer here, there was a different kind of initiative to allow people to read books without paying for them. In Argentina, again in the later 19th century, a network was set up of what were called popular libraries, bibliotecas populares, and they still exist, and they are not funded by the cities. They have volunteer workers, and in villages they don't expect the villagers to go to the library. They take the books to the villages with a van and something like that. So a circulating library in an even stronger sense. Now that takes me to the fourth library, which is the National Library, child of nationalism. So many countries, so many national libraries were founded in the course of the 19th century. Some of them, of course, were simply royal libraries or imperial libraries with the name changed, though I think also greater access. Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, next one please. That's it, the old one where many of us loved to work until the 1990s. That was the Bibliothèque Royale, and then changed its name to Nationale under the Republic. Or again, the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, one of the leading German libraries, was originally the library of the King of Prussia. Or again, next one please, the library of the British Museum in London, that famous circular reading room where, among other scholars, Karl Marx used to read books, and indeed he wrote Kapital there because it wasn't so comfortable reading at home. Or the Biblioteca Nacional in Rio de Janeiro, originally Biblioteca Imperial, and so on. In similar fashion, the Library of Congress, which was once the private library which only the deputies were allowed to consult, was transformed into a national library at the beginning of the 20th century by a librarian called Herbert Putnam. He was director of that library for 40 years, which gave him a position in which he could carry out major changes. It became, and of course it remains, a matter of considerable prestige for a nation to possess a major library, housed in an appropriately grand building. Competition between nations remains visible in this domain as the British and the French became well aware in the 1990s. François Mitterrand made it part of his cultural policy to replace the Bibliothèque Nationale with a grand new building, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And Mrs. Thatcher, at that time Prime Minister in Britain, did not want the French to overtake the British, and so she liberated funds for the construction of the British Library, replacing the library in the British Museum. Next one, please. Yeah, that's the old one, and now the next one, please. And now the new British Library. The building of such libraries forms part of what I would like to describe as the national land of knowledge in the 19th and continuing into the 20th century. This process of nationalization took institutional and material form in grandiose projects, not only for national libraries, but for national archives, national museums, and national encyclopedias, Encyclopedia Italiana in the 1930s, Encyclopédie Française, also the 1930s, and of course, on a still grander scale, the Spanish and Spanish American and the Portuguese and Brazilian encyclopedias in 50 or 100 volumes. In Britain, the most nationalist of 19th century librarians was, paradoxically, a foreigner. He was a former Italian revolutionary who took refuge in England and became the head librarian at the British Museum, Antonio Panizzi. Next, please. Panizzi declared, I want to quote him exactly, "This emphatically British library ought to be directed most particularly to British works and to works related to the British Empire." End of quote. He also argued, I quote again, "The museum is the library of the English nation, and there ought to be in that library every book that was printed either by Englishmen or in English or related to England." While one might have thought that a national library would be open to everyone, at least to all citizens, but in practice, in the 19th century, access was very often extremely limited. In the early 19th century, Panizzi's predecessor as head of the British Museum Library had very strong prejudices about both class and gender. He opposed the opening of the library in the evening because he thought this would attract two classes of undesirable people: novel readers, thinking particularly of women, and lawyers' clerks, which was his shorthand for the lower middle class. And in Paris, at about the same time, early 19th century, some people objected to the presence of what they called homeless loafers and flaneurs, vagabonds perhaps one could say, in what was still the Royal Library. I turn now then to the multimedia library. When I was a child, the meaning of the term library seemed extremely simple, when I was an enthusiastic user of my local public library. But when I became a lecturer at the new University of Sussex in 1962, I was surprised to discover that the equally new librarian had a very different idea of his duties. He was interested in acquiring manuscripts, photographs, films, microfilms, tape recordings, as not just books and journals. In 1962, this was still a slightly heretical idea among the profession of librarians, but of course, times change. These ideas have become commonplace, leading to this emergence of a fifth type of library where the books are in a minority. Books have to share space with all these other forms of communication. If you consult the website of the Library of Congress, you'll see that the collections are described as including, I quote again, books, sound recordings, motion pictures, photographs, maps, and manuscripts. I sometimes worry whether the books are becoming just a sideline in this grand and varied collection. So now comes the sixth and last of the 6 kinds of library that I mean to describe here, the virtual library. And that so as a result of accelerating technological change. In 1962, the fifth type of library seemed new, at least to people like me in Britain. So, but that library, kind of library, which was a novelty when I began my academic career, it's already old-fashioned. It's been overtaken by the virtual library. As a historian, very conscious of continuity, I regard this sixth and latest type as a descendant of a much older institution, or maybe better to say, literary genre. I'm not thinking of the library in fiction, although of course there are famous descriptions of imaginary libraries in fiction by Burke, for example, a librarian himself, but also by the polymath Umberto Eco. But no, what I'm thinking about are the proliferation of treatises about what books people should read. They're often entitled Bibliotheca, library, select library, universal library. So they talk about the idea of the library, and then more concretely, they tell the readers which books they should read on particular subjects. It's what we now know as a bibliography, but it's presented as an imagined library. I was going to describe the virtual libraries of today, Google Books, for example, or the World Digital Library, as materializations of that earlier genre. But of course, they aren't materializations because they're immaterial. They're weightless. They don't occupy space. I begin to think of them as the ghosts of books. Of course, it takes a most elaborate material apparatus to allow those ghosts to speak to us. So much for the six types. And what I want to do now in the second part of this lecture is to say just a little bit about the history of the material culture of libraries in all those years that have elapsed from the early medieval cupboard until the library of today. If I'm not wrong, curiously little has been written on this topic. If I'm wrong, you'll tell me. If I'm right, I hope I encourage somebody in the audience to undertake research on the material culture of particular libraries here and elsewhere. So, the first type of library, you only need either a cupboard or a chest. But the research library needs rather more elaborate furnishings. It needs shelves, needs chairs, tables, or desks. Some libraries have gone much further. Some libraries used to be equipped with pens and inkwells. When I first began working in the British Museum Library, 1950s, at each desk there was an inkwell. I think today's librarians were probably horrified at this idea. There are so many libraries where you can't even bring in a ball pen. Then the idea of an open inkwell and the possibilities of spilling, and it must have haunted the dreams of nightmares of librarians. But in the 18th century, standard furniture for any decent library, two large globes. Next one, please. One of the heavens and one of the earth. These particular globes, very well preserved, may still be seen in Rome in the Casa Natense Library, which was founded by an 18th century cardinal, still open to readers and to visits by the public. So if you happen to be in Rome, I strongly recommend a visit to the Casa Natense. And now, as the number of books increased, the shelves became higher and higher. Next one, please. Therefore, ladders to reach them had to become longer and longer. I mean, it's quite frightening. You see this old man balanced on a very high ladder, and one expects any moment he may fall off and kill himself. Of course, there'd be, one could say it's an appropriate death for a scholar, and the great Italian historian Delio Cantimori did die in the later 20th century precisely because he fell from the ladder consulting books in his own house. And then, as the number of readers increased, there had to be more and more seating. In the 17th century, the Ambrosiana Library in Milan, which I already mentioned, one of Europe's great libraries in the 17th century, it had seats for only 42 readers. But today, the British Library claims, I'm quoting from the website, it offers on-site space for over 1,200 readers. And I can tell you from experience that even with 1,200 places, it can be very difficult to find a seat sometimes. Again, as books proliferated, cataloguing became more and more complicated. Catalogues expanded to fill many folio volumes, and right up into the late 20th century, certain more conservative libraries, like the libraries of the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, they still had the old catalogue system. Enormous folios which were really very hard to pick up. And it became very good exercise for the wrist, just to try to raise the catalogue and then to open it. And then you would find, if you wanted to consult a 19th century book, that the catalogue entry was written by hand in 19th century handwriting, which was sometimes very difficult for us students in the 1960s, say, to decipher. When we had to fill in forms to order books, then all we could do was to imitate the script and hope that an expert librarian would be able to decode this and bring us the right book. In more, let's say, in less traditional libraries than Oxford, the card index had already been introduced in the middle of the 19th century. Harvard, for example, there was a card catalogue already in the year 1861. And that system lasted until recent memory, when the catalogue went online. Some North American librarians celebrated in a rather carnivalesque fashion, and they burnt the cards. Now, as readers became more numerous, then noise became a more and more serious problem. Next one, please. In the 17th century, Sir Christopher Wren's famous design for Trinity College Library in Cambridge. Can you go back one? I forgot. Let's. They're in the wrong order. So I should say, in the 20th century, early 20th century, Melvin Dewey insisted on carpeted floors so that there would be less noise in the library. Now, if you go to the next one, maybe that's it. That's Trinity College Library. It's a marble floor. That was Christopher Wren's idea. A marble floor, there would be less noise of footsteps than there would be otherwise. Thank you. In the days before I retired, when I gave 2 lectures a week, I could give a lecture and not feel my mouth drying up. But this is the result. I'm out of practice. Today, while many paper books are transferred to the basement if they're not destroyed, libraries have come to include more and more apparatus. Personal computers, microfilm readers, photocopying machines, not to mention toilets and cafeterias. Water fountains have become essential, at least in North America, though they're only making a gradual appearance in Britain. Next one, please. This image suggests, at least to me, the fountain was installed by the librarian with a certain reluctance. I think it may be even more important. There is a history still waiting to be written of the many attempts to solve the problems of heating and lighting in research libraries. The main problem seems to be insoluble, as the eternal conflict between what is good for the books and what is good for the readers. You can't have both. Over the centuries, there have been many debates about the use of candles, gas lamps, electricity, stoves, central heating. Even today, if you wish to use the famous Bodleian Library in Oxford, before you are allowed to enter the library, you have to swear an oath. It's available now in 60 or maybe 100 languages, although it was rather amusing that when my wife was admitted and they gave her the Portuguese text, she pointed out several grammatical mistakes in it. The sub-librarian who was admitting her did not look at all pleased. Anyway, the oath includes these words: I shall not bring any fire or flame into the library. Of course, if it's cold, readers may have a problem. In the year 1836, a House of Commons committee investigated the facilities proposed for the Library of the British Museum. It was still under construction in the 1830s. One of the questions to the architect concerned heating. One of the members of the committee asked this question, I quote, "Are you aware of any means adopted in the Bibliothèque du Roi," that is in Paris, "to maintain warmth?" Answer: there are none. Readers in the Bibliothèque du Roi, said the architect, I quote, "must keep themselves warm as well as they can." Even today, returning to the website of the British Library, you will find the following statement, I quote again, "The temperatures inside the reading rooms are set to protect our collections and may feel cool, so please bring an extra layer for your comfort." As for lighting, it was only in 1893 that electric light was installed at every seat in the library, in the circular reading room of the British Museum. It's a little bit late because electric light was becoming general in Britain as in other parts of Europe in the 1880s. But until 1893, if it was foggy, then the reading room would close. It was just going to be impossible to see well enough to read the books. And of course, the 19th century was a time when foggy days were still extremely common in London, as they remained until the 1950s, and then the decrease in heating by coal means that foggy London has become a myth. I ought to say, on behalf of librarians who were hostile to the new invention, that electric light could be dangerous, especially in the early years of its installation, and that in the year 1904 there was a fire in the university library in Torino that was definitely caused by faulty wiring. Surveillance of readers, especially the readers of rare and illustrated books, is of course an unfortunate necessity. And that affects the material culture of libraries, the design of reading rooms, for example. In 1836, a suggestion was made for a circular reading room in the Bibliothèque Royale in Paris. In other words, 20 years earlier than the famous circular reading room of the British Museum. And the argument for it was not the beauty of a circular reading room. It was simply to facilitate surveillance from the center on the principles of the notorious panopticon, that 19th century design for a prison that became famous when Michel Foucault discussed it in 1975 in his book Surveiller et Punir. I think it's a pity that Foucault, who wrote about monasteries, about factories, about prisons, about asylums, but he didn't include a chapter on libraries. He might have noted that whatever the reason for the choice, Panizzi adopted that circular plan for the British Museum. Well, I think it's time to conclude. And since I'm not a librarian, maybe I should really leave the practical conclusion from this account to you. Nevertheless, having lived through a time of rapid change, I shall at least express a personal opinion. I must admit, in the first place, to regretting the gradual decline of the physical community of readers in major research libraries. It's true, it's not a face-to-face community, but at least it might be described as an elbow-to-elbow community. I like to study in a place surrounded by other people studying. At times it can feel very lonely if you are spending several hours with a book in a room and nobody else is visible. A colleague of mine in Cambridge, professor of history, can regularly be found at that chain of coffee shops in Britain, Caffè Nero. He's sitting at a stool with his personal computer and he's writing a book. I asked him, wasn't it a bit quieter in his college? And he said, no, I like the noise. I can only write when I'm surrounded by people making a noise and drinking coffee and so on. And so, well, I share some of that attitude. But then on the positive side, I really appreciate this new opportunity to consult the library catalogue or to download articles without the trouble of walking for so many minutes to Cambridge University Library. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I can get from my home to one of the best libraries in England on foot in 20 minutes. But still, you can find me downloading some things from online. And so finally, returning to the variety of ideas of the library, the competition and conflict between them. I remain an unrepentant pluralist. I do hope, and I'm optimistic enough to believe, that it is possible to combine the best from each idea in some future synthesis. So I have to rely on you to tell me whether or not this dream has any chance of becoming a reality. Thank you for your attention.
Eu gostaria de colocar que as perguntas para o Sr. Peter, ele pediu a gentileza de mandar por escrito. Então, se vocês tiverem perguntas para o Sr. Peter nesse momento, que mandem por escrito, por favor, que é o pedido dele. Em português. Por favor, se vocês tiverem perguntas, enviem por escrito a pedido do Sr. Peter em português. Tem um bloquinho aqui, é só você levantar a mão que o Arthur, ele vai até você escreve e ele traz a pergunta. Por favor. Alguém mais quer fazer perguntas? Nós não podemos perder uma oportunidade dessa. Eu vou ler a pergunta e vou passar para o Sr. Peter. Uma pergunta do Rodrigo a Wikipédia acabou com o papel do bibliotecário?
No, I don't think Wikipedia ended anything more than the paper encyclopedia. So from the equivalent today of those grand national encyclopedias of the past, Encyclopedia Britannica or Brockhaus in Germany or Larousse in France and so on. Because when you look up an article in Wikipedia, first there is the problem, it isn't completely reliable. That was also true with the articles in the big encyclopedias like the Britannica. The great advantage of Wikipedia, as I see it, is that it provides intellectual health warnings, right, that stare you in the face as you begin to read the article. Remember, this article may be biased. This article does not have sufficient sources, and so on. That's a great advance, and you never had anything like that with paper encyclopedias. And of course, Wikipedia also has the advantage it can be updated regularly, quite fast. The day after the great historian Eric Hobsbawm died, I looked him up again in Wikipedia. They already had the date of death recorded. So Wikipedia has these advantages, but at the same time, it doesn't replace books, and therefore it doesn't replace libraries, and therefore it doesn't replace librarians. When Wikipedia was very new, I remember I would ask a student, why did you make this statement in your essay? And he would say, in the first years, I found it online. Or a bit later, I read it in Wikipedia. And then I would ask, but what do you think were the sources? Where did the person who wrote it online get the information from? And so you have to initiate this chain if you want to be a good historian. You trace this statement back to the source, and then you criticize the source. Wikipedia can't do it for you. Though more and more, with its footnotes and its bibliography, it does give students the chance, if they're willing, to perform this much more laborious task, which will take them to the sources.
Nós temos duas perguntas. Uma das perguntas eu não vou fazer porque é um pedido do Sr. Peter, ele não vai responder nenhuma pergunta de cunho político do Brasil. A próxima pergunta: qual a sua opinião sobre os e-books e o futuro dessa modalidade? Maria, diretora da UEL, Londrina.
I suppose I shouldn't say a word against e-books because most of my own books have become e-books now. On the other hand, I have to admit I have never read a whole book online. I don't possess a Kindle or any of those rival machines which allow you to do so, because is this just something from my generation? But there's a physical pleasure in handling books. Like my friend Robert Johnson, I even take pleasure in smelling books. I remember in the days of the USSR and the communist countries like Poland and Hungary, the books that were produced in that part of the world had a particular smell. I never found out why it was. There must have been probably a different kind of glue used in the binding, whatever. So I could have had my eyes closed, and you could have given me a book, and I would have said, it's been printed somewhere between Warsaw and Moscow, I'm just not quite sure where. So if the e-book drove out the physical book completely, that, for me and many other people, would be a great loss. But I suspect that this is not going to happen. I take comfort as a historian from history. I remember I've read that when Gutenberg began to produce these books that were printed on the printing press, then not everybody was delighted. Some people feared that those beautiful manuscripts produced by scribes were going to disappear. They didn't. So a kind of coexistence came into play, so that manuscripts influenced printed books influenced manuscripts, and then a kind of division of labor developed so that certain kinds of information were communicated in manuscript, other kinds of information in print. And my guess is that the e-book and indeed the online newspaper will coexist for quite a long time with the original paper book and paper newspaper, though in the case of newspapers I'm less optimistic than in the case of whole books. and that, I think, would be a solution which has the advantages of both media of communication.
Nós temos mais algumas perguntas, mas nós vamos encerrar as perguntas com essas aqui. Se alguém, né, nós vamos encerrar. E depois do nosso encerramento, nós temos um coffee break. Então, Sr. Peter, as bibliotecas físicas vão acabar algum dia? Tendo vivenciado as mudanças nas bibliotecas, quais são os novos desafios que você acha que viremos enfrentar? Rafael Dawel. Professor Peter, é uma grande honra ouvir todo o seu conhecimento. Quais conselhos o senhor daria para inovar nas bibliotecas? Qual o futuro das bibliotecas? Como se conectar com os leitores? Luta da Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. O professor João Vitor, uma das maiores editoras do Brasil, parou de editar seus livros, mas eles são disputados por sua qualidade de formatação. O que além de informação os livros podem oferecer? E professor Peter, o senhor acha que com a curadoria digital, as bibliotecas virtuais, estamos retornando ao sistema de monastérios com os acervos mais restritos fisicamente? Obrigado pela atenção. Então, essas perguntas o senhor Peter irá responder e daí nós estaremos... nós vamos encerrar as nossas perguntas. Depois eu passo para a professora. Ah, sim, entendi. Tem mais duas perguntas. Entendi, professora. E eu vou ler todas e vou passar para o senhor, Sr. Peter. A professora Márcia, professora do curso de Pedagogia aqui da UEPG. No Brasil temos muitas bibliotecas que são formadas por pessoas simples que iniciam essas bibliotecas com doações ou mesmo com livros recolhidos dos lixos. Como você vê essa iniciativa? E Evelyn Orlando, professora da PUC Paraná. Robert Darton aponta essa questão das bibliotecas dos Estados Unidos em uma nova perspectiva. Um povo diferente. Ele fala, por exemplo, que não percebe esse delírio e não vê a morte do livro como algo real no horizonte. Dentro dessa realidade que o senhor apresenta, como o senhor percebe essa questão da vitalidade ou morte dos livros? Encerra-se com essas perguntas.
Yes, once I had the opportunity to discuss the problems of the book today with Robert Darnton in person at Parachi in these famous annual meetings to talk about books and authors. And we did disagree a bit in a friendly way. I suppose one should never use over-dramatic language, and maybe the death of the book is too strong. But the decline of the physical book does seem both obvious and impossible to reverse. Yes, I did not know that in Brazil there are many libraries which have been collected by ordinary people, and I think that's marvelous, and I wish that that initiative were imitated in Britain. Yes, here I'm asked to make a comparison between the virtual library and the monastic library. But I'm not sure I understand this comparison, because to me they seem almost opposite. Because thanks to the extreme physicality of the medieval manuscript, that it was expensive and it took a long time for the scribes to copy, that meant that the monks were very keen to keep it away from most people, because after all, the more a book is read, the greater the danger that the book will be destroyed. But if you manage to read the book with your eyes without touching it with your fingers, as happens with the digital library, this danger disappears. So for me, these are opposites rather than similar. So I'm asked what books can offer besides information. So many things, because we don't read a novel for information, but because it stimulates our imagination thanks to the still richer imagination of the author. And so I think that books can do many things for us. Actually, in the Middle Ages, some people believed in the therapeutic power of books. They believed this in a more literal manner because they believed that if a sick person touched the right kind of book, that might cure the illness. I share the belief in a less literal way. I think that when people are ill, it is a help to them to read certain kinds of book, maybe particularly fiction. I know people who say that they felt better, they were helped to recover by doing this. And so I'm asked to give advice for the innovation in libraries, but I feel that this is very much for everybody else here, for the professional librarians to answer this question. And again, I can't really talk about the future of libraries. I imagine, and this is what historians do, that in the next few decades we will see the development of tendencies which are already here. But beyond the next 30 years, all we know about the future is that what is going to happen is not the same as what people expected to happen. I've been asked about whether there is a new challenge for the librarians, but I think there are so many old challenges which remain challenges. But perhaps the biggest challenge I thought about was with the fifth type of library, because then it's the responsibility of the librarian to decide how much of the library budget should go on books, how much on subscriptions to journals, how much on DVDs, and how much on other forms of communication. I think that's enormously difficult. It's a big responsibility, but the librarian has to be the person to make the decision. I can't see any other possibility. Finally, will physical libraries come to an end one day? Well, always dangerous when you're asked about the future. You need always to make a clear distinction between what you think will happen and what you want to happen in the future. Of course, I very much want physical libraries to continue to exist. I can't give a firm answer to the question whether they will, because that depends on funding. And we live in a time when funding for libraries in some countries, including my own, is being cut. So I would like to be more optimistic. All I can say is I hope these physical libraries continue, and I'm not entirely sure whether they will or not.
Em nome da Universidade Estadual de Ponta Grossa, agradecemos ao professor Peter, que tão gentilmente atendeu ao convite para brilhantar a noite de abertura deste 4º Encontro Paranaense de Bibliotecários. Reiteramos os nossos agradecimentos pela presença das ilustres autoridades aos senhores convidados que prestigiaram neste evento. Teremos a seguir um coffee break, todos estão convidados. Vamos passar um vídeo e teremos nosso coffee break. Lembramos que amanhã, dia 9, teremos a continuidade das atividades do 4º Encontro Paranaense de Bibliotecários a partir das 8 horas. Boa noite a todos.